job, when my kids are born, when my kids leave the house, when, when and then thinking, then I'll be happy. Last week, I shared with you 5 laws of happiness, and one of them is that happiness is a choice. You're as happy as you choose to be. If you're unhappy, you can't blame anybody for your unhappiness, because happiness is a choice. You don't go looking for happiness, you create it. It is something you create. And happiness, by the way, is not a goal. We talked about this last week. It is the byproduct of right thinking and right acting. Now, there are 4 common barriers to happiness. I want you to just write these down at the top of your notes there. 4 common barriers. I call these the killjoys of life, because when any of these enter into your life, then they're going to rob your happiness unless you're prepared for them. The first one, of course, is pain. Pain is a killjoy. It's hard to be happy and in pain at the same time. This morning, Kay and I were moving some Christmas boxes out of the attic down to the garage, which we had just remodeled a little bit. And as she stepped down the stairs, she fell over backwards. Yeah, and really hurt herself. And for the next hour, she was in major pain. There's no way she was going to be happy while she was in pain. And I was getting ice packs and things like that. And pain is a killjoy. But there's another one, and you're familiar with this one too. I call it picky people. Picky people. People of all kinds, actually, can cause you to lose your joy. They can be irritating, they can be demanding, they can be uncooperative, they can be arrogant. People are a common killjoy in life. Number 3, pressure. Pressure can cause you to lose your happiness. And you can have pressure from within yourself, or you can have it around you. It can be internal or it can be external. And then number 4, and one you're all familiar with, of course, is problems. Problems. And there are all kinds of problems. So pain, people, pressures, and problems all are what I call the killjoys. Now, in Philippians chapter 1, verses 12 down to about verse 30 or so, Paul talks about all 4 of these killjoys. And we have an example of how to be happy no matter what's going on in your life. Now, I want to remind you that Paul, when he writes this book, the happiest book, he's in prison. He's in prison in Rome. In fact, the last 4 years of Paul's life had gone like this before he wrote this happiest book in the Bible. He spent 2 years in jail in Caesarea on false charges. 2 years in jail for false charges. Then he is sent on the way to Rome, and he is shipwrecked in the Mediterranean Ocean on the way to Rome, and he ends up on a desert island in the Mediterranean, and he's stranded there for a while with some people, and while he's there are some snakes, poisonous snakes on that island. He actually gets bit by a snake while he's there. Then he's imprisoned again for another 2 years in Rome with a guard chained to him 24 hours a day. So he has no privacy at all. He's in prison in Rome with a Praetorian guard, because he was such an important prisoner, chained to him 24 hours a day. He has no privacy. Now, Paul has every reason to be bitter. He has every reason to be unhappy. He has every reason to be depressed and have a pity party. Instead, he writes this book on happiness and on joy. Now, let me read you today's text. It's Philippians 1, 12 to 30. It starts like this. I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, Paul's writing, that everything that has happened to me has helped me to spread the good news. For everyone here, including all the soldiers in the palace guard, know that I am in chains because of Christ. And I have gained confidence. And because of my imprisonment, many of the Christians here have gained confidence and become more bold in telling others about Christ. Now, some are sharing Christ out of jealousy and rivalry. He's talking about the people who are outside. But others preach Christ with pure motives, and they love me, and they know that the Lord brought me here to defend the good news. But there are those who do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. And they preach with selfish ambition, and they're not sincere, intending to make my time in prison more painful to me. But whether or not their motives are pure, the fact remains that the message about Christ is being preached, so I rejoice. And I will continue to rejoice no matter what. For I know that as you pray for me, he's writing to people in the Philippi, the church in a city in Greece called Philippi. It's called Philippians. If he's writing to us, it'd be First Californians. For I know, he says, that you are praying for me, and as the Spirit of Jesus helps me, this will all turn out for my deliverance. And I live in eager expectation and hope. And then he says, I want my life to always honor Christ, whether I live or I die. For to me, living is for Christ, and dying is even better. If I live, it just means more fruitful service, years of service for Christ, but I'm often torn between two desires. Sometimes I want to live, and sometimes I long to go on and be with Christ in heaven. That would be far better for me. But it's better for you if I live, so that you can grow and that you can experience the joy of your faith. But whatever happens, you must live in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. Don't be intimidated by your enemies. It will be a sign to them of their downfall that God's with you and that he will save you. For you have been given not only the privilege of trusting in Christ, but also the privilege of suffering for him. And we are in this fight together. You've seen me suffer for Christ in the past, and you know that I am still in the middle of a great struggle. Now, that's a very warm, personal note that Paul's writing. This is a very personal book. This letter he's writing to his friends in the church of Philippi that he started. And in this passage, he covers these 4 different killjoys. And he talks about how he has dealt with them, how he's maintained his happiness in spite of everything going in ways he hadn't planned. Now, the key verse in this whole passage I just read is verse 27. It's there on your outline, and it says this: whatever happens, conduct yourself in a manner worthy of the good news of Christ. So in this passage, we learn how to be happy no matter what, even if you're in prison in Rome. And Paul models 4 habits. Let's get right into it. Number 1, I can be happy no matter what happens in my life if, number 1, I look at every problem from God's viewpoint. If I look at every problem from God's viewpoint. You see, happy people have a larger perspective. They have a bigger worldview. They see the big picture. When I don't have the big picture, when I don't see things from God's point of view, I get discouraged, I get frustrated, I get unhappy. The reason we get unhappy is because we don't see what God does. And the truth is, no matter what's going on in your life, the good, bad, the ugly, God is working out a plan. And he even takes all of our mistakes and even puts those into the plan. He says, I can use that too. My sins, yes. My faults, yes. What other people do, yes. God says, I can fit it all into the plan. And Paul knew this. And so he starts out, the first verse is verse 12, and he says this: now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me has helped spread the good news. Now let me explain what's going on here. Ever since Paul had become a Christian on the road to Damascus, he had dreamed one great dream, and that was this: I want to preach in Rome. Rome is the center of the universe. Rome is the capital of the empire. Rome is the most prestigious, powerful, strategic city in the world. We've picked out 12 of those strategic cities where we're planting this year and next year churches at Saddleback. But if we had been planning in those days, we would have been planning in Rome. There's no doubt about that. There was no nation more important than the Roman Empire, and there was no city more important than Rome. So Paul's dream is sharing Christ at the center of the universe. And what he wants to do is this. He wants to go to Rome, he wants to rent the Colosseum, and he wants to do a harvest crusade for 6 months. That's what Paul's thinking. I'm going to Rome to preach. God had another idea. Paul, you're going to go as a prisoner, and I'm going to make you a royal prisoner of Caesar. Now, does anybody know who was Caesar at this point? Nero. You ever heard of that guy? Yeah, Nero. About as wicked and as bad as you can get. So Paul is a prisoner of Nero. And as a royal prisoner with a royal guard chained to him 24 hours a day, he gets to talk to all kinds of key people he would never otherwise talk to because he's an important prisoner. He's chained 24 hours a day to a palace guard for 2 years. They changed that guard every 4 hours. So I added it up. Over 2 years, he witnessed to 4,380 guards. Now my question is, who's the real prisoner here? Who has the captive audience? Paul is talking to the entire court of Caesar's palace. And God says, this is my plan. You want to go do the big city lights national crusade, but I'm going to put you in prison. And there were 2 results of it, we know for sure. Chapter 4, when we get to later on, will tell us that within 2 years, some of Nero's own family had become believers because Paul was a prisoner in Rome. Some of the royal family had become Christians because Paul was in prison. And second, Paul, it's kind of like Rick Warren. It's hard to get him to sit down, sit still, not stop moving. He's forced to sit still, and he, as a result, writes the New Testament. I wonder which had a bigger impact. Go do a harvest crusade in the Colosseum, or be forced to sit still hour after hour and write Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and on, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and 1st, 2nd Thessalonians, and most of the New Testament. This is why Paul says, I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me, being in prison, has helped spread the good news. So he says, I've got my plan, but God has a bigger plan. And he says, I can be happy because I can see what God is doing through my problem. And you're starting to be unhappy. You need to do what Paul does. Learn to see it from God's point of view. What is God doing here? What's the bigger picture? What's the bigger perspective? And then you'll be able to face the problem in faith. And when you face the problem in faith, 2 things will happen. Write these down. First, it's a witness to unbelievers. When Christians handle big problems in faith, it is a witness to unbelievers. That's why in verse 13 he says, for everyone here, talking about the palace guard and in the royal prison, everyone here, including all the soldiers in the palace guard, knows that I'm in chains because of Christ. Well, I guess so. He'd witnessed over 4,000 times to guys chained to him. It's a witness to unbelievers. Number 2, it's an encouragement to believers. Verse 14, he says this, and because of my imprisonment, many of the Christians here have gained confidence, those in Rome, and they've become more bold in telling others about Christ. It's a witness to unbelievers. It's an encouragement to believers. Have you ever thought that God might want to use the problem you're going through right now for the very same reason? You know, since Matthew died, both of these have been true in my life. It has been a witness to unbelievers. It's been an encouragement to believers. Why? Because Kay and I looked at the problem from God's perspective, not our own, and we faced it in faith. This week, the story went out in People magazine. I never imagined in my lifetime that I would ever be on People magazine. I mean, I know I'm that good looking, but I never imagined in my lifetime that I would be in People, on the cover of People magazine. So how many people have heard the gospel since Matthew died? Millions. Millions. because of all of the stories and the interviews and the CNN and all that. Millions have heard the good news. And I could say, like Paul, I want you to know, friends, that all that has happened to me has worked out for the furthering of the good news. Have you ever thought that that might be true in the problem in your life? If you will look at it from that way, it's going to change your perspective in a major way. All right, number 2, second habit. I can be happy no matter what happens if I never let others control my attitude. And this is a good example of Paul gives us right here in this passage. I can be happy no matter what happens in my life if I never let others control my attitude. I don't let them decide whether I'm going to be happy or not. Now, Paul, in this next section, he talks about 4 kinds of people. And while he's in prison, he says, now there are some people who are attacking my ministry. They slandered Paul. They judged Paul. They criticized Paul. They were gossip mongers. There were some people who supported his ministry that were friends. There were some who competed with his ministry. They're trying to kick him while he's down. And there were some who were, undermining his ministry. And they're even trying to destroy him. They're trying to rub it in. He's in prison. They're trying to make it more painful. And in Philippians chapter 1, verses 15 to 17, Paul describes 4 kinds of people. 3 of them are killjoys. One's a good kind. And he says, there are 4 kinds of people in my life. There are critics, who are slandering me and who are creating all kinds of controversy. There are comrades, that's my friends. There are competitors who are preaching Christ out of rivalry. And he said there are conspirators who just want to make my problem worse. They want to rub it in. They want to kick me while I'm down, while I'm in prison. They're my enemies. Now notice these verses there on your outline. First verse, this is verse 15, talking about critics. He says, it is true that some preach Christ because they are jealous and quarrelsome. Circle the word quarrelsome. That word in Greek is the word eris, E-R-I-S, and it means they love to argue. Have you ever met anybody like that? They love to argue. They love conflict. They enjoy creating controversy. They enjoy getting into a cat fight. These people are contentious. They are divisive. They are critical. Have you ever heard a radio preacher like that? They're out there. Have you ever read a blogger or saw somebody on social media who was contentious and critical of somebody's ministry or this or that? If you haven't, just go to my website. And you'll find hundreds. There'll be plenty. Now, notice that here, he says they're jealous and they're quarrelsome. Notice that the critic's motive is usually jealousy. When people criticize something, they usually are jealous of it. But what he's saying here is, he says, I have to deal with these people. And would you agree that few things could rob your happiness faster than being criticized? When you're criticized at work, or you're criticized by friends, or you're criticized by neighbors, your stomach starts churning. Why? Because we all want to be loved. We all want to be approved. We want everybody to like us. Let me give you a little happiness hint, one of those little HHs. You might write this down. I don't need other people's approval to be happy. I don't need other people's approval. I don't need other people's permission to be happy. You're as happy as you choose to be. If they're unhappy, that's their choice. But you don't have to depend on other people's approval in order to be happy. And if you haven't got it now, you're probably not going to get it. And you're going to be miserable if you try to live for the approval of everybody else. Paul is modeling here, never let others control your attitude. And some of these people, they're just jealous and they're quarrelsome and they're cranky and they criticize everything I do in my ministry. And then in the next verse, verse 16, he talks about the good guys. These are his friends. These are his comrades. He says, others preach Christ from genuine goodwill, and they do so out of love. That's the real reason we share the good news, out of love. And they know that God has given me the work of defending the gospel. So he says, those people bring me joy, obviously. Then in verse 17, he talks about another killjoy, competitors. He says, others preach Christ insincerely from a spirit of selfish ambition. Circle the phrase selfish ambition. He said, I hate to say this, but there are actually people in ministry. There are people with national ministries, radio, television, and books, and who are ego-driven. And how do you know when somebody's ego-driven? They put other people down all the time to build themselves up. That's when you know somebody's ministering in selfish ambition. They feel compelled to put other people down in order to build themselves up. Now, you're not a preacher, but if you're in any kind of business, you have competitors. And if you don't deal with this, competitors will rob your happiness. And you'll look at what they're doing. You can have competition over the color of your lawn. Neighbor's yard's greener. We better get ours going. You can have competition over the car you drive. You can have competition over your kids. My kid was student of the month at Folsom Prison. And that's competition. My kid, and I'm so proud. You can compete over hairstyles. You can compete over shoes. Don't look at people right now, but that's true. That's true. And if you don't deal with this, you're going to be unhappy a lot of your life, because critics will rob your happiness and competitors will rob your happiness. And Paul says, even in the ministry, there are competitors. And they're selfishly, ambitiously, and insincerely preaching the good news. And then in the second part of verse 7,